Good morning or afternoon or evening, whenever you're watching this. This is part three of our discussion on World War One, our third and final part. We were looking at some of the major battles, some of the key events as the war raged on. We had talked about the Battle of the Somme, which, look, the war was going very, very badly for both sides. Millions of men are being killed. In fact, um, there were more British soldiers killed in the first 3 days at the Battle of the Somme than Americans killed and wounded in World War One, the Korean War, and Vietnam War combined. That's how deadly that battle was. So the offensive finally ends at the end of 1916 with all those mass casualties and deaths. British poet Edmund Blunden, who had survived the Battle of the Somme, wrote, quote, "Neither race had won nor could win the war. The war had won and would go on winning." So as we move into 1917, this will continue to go very bad for the Russians. We will cover the Russian Revolution later. The Romanians actually will switch sides to the Allies, but that's not going to help matters in the beginning. On the Eastern Front, there were so many people dying that German General Paul von Hindenburg claimed there was no way of knowing how many Russians had been killed. Okay. Um, in June of 1916, the Russians attempted an offensive attack but were stopped by Austrian and German troops. Some put the casualty figures for both sides at 1,000,000 men. And the winter of 1916 and 17 continued to be bleak. So that brings us to the home front. You have all this massive sacrifices being made on the Western and Eastern fronts. You have to keep these troops supplied. You have to keep sending more troops. And you have to have the support of your citizens at home. So let's look at some of the key things that were done during this war at home. Okay. Here's our sound again. So this was total war, which required the full support of everybody at home. You had to once again mobilize so many supplies. You had to choose, to make sure that you had enough guns, as they say, and enough butter, food, and ammunition. This was a war of attrition. Okay. Um, Propaganda was a key element of this war, keeping people at home supportive. And also, if you're in the war, the United States is still out of the war, and the Allies are going to really use propaganda to try to get the United States on their side. Okay, so that's done by creating hatred of the enemy. It's not always using the truth or, of course, exaggerating the truth. We had talked about earlier when the Germans went through Belgium. Look, there's atrocities committed by all sides in almost every war, if not every war. But Britain and France were very, very good at exaggerating the atrocities and pointing out the atrocities made by the Germans. They often exaggerated them. Here's a couple famous posters. A derogatory term there, beat the Hun, obviously making the Germans look like a beast. There's another poster. So peacetime industries were converted to wartime industries. You have to produce a lot of machinery. A lot of rights were curtailed for workers as strikes were forbidden. More and more drinking is going on. Of course, people trying to cope with the misery of this war. So Britain started restricting access or hours on their pubs. And this is when daylight savings time was introduced in order to conserve fuel, something that we've kept since. A lot of essential commodities were rationed. And women are going to play a very prominent role in this war, producing things at home, working as nurses in the battles. And this is going to lead to them getting suffrage in most European countries. And of course, you probably know the United States when the war ends. And there's a stat on how many women stepped up into jobs in Britain. Look, things were getting so bad on the Eastern Front that you're going to see some pictures of women actually fighting in the war for Germany and Russia by the end of the war. Here's some propaganda trying to get women to work in these vital positions. See German women factory workers here, working on farms as well, working as nurses. It's American propaganda here. We're about to get the United States into this war as we look at the final stages in a few minutes. There's some Russian women soldiers. I don't get to tell my bad jokes in class, which, usually breaks it up for me and sometimes for you. So I figured I'd put in a meme, and this is today's meme. Remember this guy? Yeah, pretty good. So let's get to the final stages of the war. We're into 1917. Once again, many of the key events and people I will not go into great detail about because that will be provided at our global summit meeting. Okay. But when you get to 1917, there's going to be two events of great consequence that will change the course of the war. One, the United States will enter the war on the Allied side. Why? We're going to see the German use of unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied shipping is going to drag the United States into the war. The second point is Russia is going to be out. We're going to see a revolution. The Bolsheviks are going to seize power, and that will be, we'll discuss that in great detail later. And lucky for the Allies, the United States did join because the French army's now on the verge of collapse. You start to see some mutinies occurring within the French divisions, mutinies basically soldiers leaving or going against orders from their commanders. And the Germans are going to produce a massive offensive in March of 1918, which will push the Allied forces back further than they had been since 1914. So by early 1918, things don't look so good for the Allies. So let's see how the United States got into this war. I'm sure you remember some of these things from your study of US 2. This is a English ship, the Lusitania, a passenger ship, which was sunk by the Germans on May 7th, 1915. 1,200 people are going to be killed, roughly 128 Americans, and this is going to anger Americans. You see on the left there that the German government actually placed these ads in the New York Times a week or so prior to the Lusitania sailing. They believed that the Allies were getting a lot of munitions, a lot of weapons, and a lot of supplies that would help them win the war. It was disclosed at a later date that there was some weaponry in the bottom of this ship being transported over, and the Allies were trading at a much higher rate with the United States than Germany and the Central Powers. Okay. So the outrage in America and President Woodrow Wilson, who demanded that Germany stop this practice of sinking ships. The German government did accept this demand by September 1st. The fact remained only with submarines could Germany prevent Britain from maintaining total control of the high seas. So they will, in the future, pledge to warn ships before they fire, especially passenger ships. Look, the British were blockading the Germans as well, and they were having much greater success. And in February of 1917, the Germans said that its submarines would attack any ship in what they called war zones. So they're going to sink the British ship, the Sussex, in March of 1916, and the United States government will forcefully protest, and that's when the Sussex Pledge was reaffirmed. Okay. Here is another reason that the United States got dragged into this war. This was a note, basically called the Zimmermann Telegram. Arthur Zimmermann, who was the German Foreign Secretary, evidently sent this to Mexico, was intercepted by the British, and they were all too happy to turn this over to the United States. It might have been the work of someone within the United States or even the British government. But the fact of the matter is, Americans believed that the Germans were trying to form an alliance with Mexico and promised the Mexicans that they would return the states of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it would go to war with the United States. And President Wilson used the telegram to bolster support for a declaration of war. Once again, the key reason for the United States getting involved is German unrestricted submarine warfare. They will sink 3 more ships, American ships, in the spring of 1917. And the United States will start readying itself for war. They will start drafting an army, and their army will be about 4 million by November of 1918. So we talked about Russia withdrawing from the war. We talked again earlier about the end of 1916. The Russian and Austria-Hungarian armies were depleted and exhausted from fighting one another. There were a lot of strikes in Russia in February of 1917. Those bread riots. Once again, if you do not want a revolution in your country, make sure people have bread, as we've learned. Well, bread riots in Petrograd. Petrograd was St. Petersburg. They changed the name during the war to sound more Russian. So when we talk about Petrograd, that's what we're talking about. So these riots will spread rapidly. Tsar Nicholas II is going to abdicate the throne on March 15th, 1917. A provisional government promised the lands of the Tsar and the Orthodox Church to the peasantry. Many soldiers will desert. The Germans will break the Russian offensive and push them back nearly 100 miles. There's a communist party in Russia that was very well organized. They were named the Bolsheviks. They will grow an influence in especially major cities and in the army. So on November 6th, 1917, the Bolsheviks will overthrow the provisional government, and the country's new leader will be Vladimir Lenin. And he wanted an instant peace with Germany, and Germany accepted the request. The French and British governments both rejected Lenin's call for an armistice, and obviously because they will lose the two-front war that was being fought. And they were also fearful of socialism/communism spreading to France and England. So by December of 1917, the Bolsheviks declared the war over. Finland, Ukraine, Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland became independent under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And we're going to focus, I'll show you a map of that later, and it'll probably be carried in it'll be covered in greater detail in our project. So there is war also going on in the Middle East that we have to talk about. The British will take advantage of Arab resentment, particularly by Muslim fundamentalists of the Turks, who had ruled much of the Middle East for centuries, to stir up revolts. By 1914, 85,000 Jews had moved to Palestine in hopes of gaining a homeland as the Ottoman Empire declined. We had talked in our last unit about the British government supporting a Zionist movement that had started earlier in the century, or at the end of the last century, which is a movement for a Jewish state, but it also hoped to add to Turkish troubles. So on November 2nd, 1917, the Balfour Declaration expressed British willingness to support the future creation of a national home for Jews, a state in Palestine, once the Turks had been driven out. And such a state would recognize the right of Arab populations who already live there. And that's obviously been a point of contention to this day. So the British government realized that the eventual creation of a Jewish state in Palestine would serve as a buffer between the Suez Canal and Syria. And Syria, at the end of the war, will be controlled by France. So they will make sure that they have a lot of influence in that territory. So December 1917, a British force took Jerusalem. The Central Powers ally Turkey was on the verge of collapse. So a lot going on in the Middle East. So that brings us to, we will cover the end of the war in our project, but the United States is going to greatly aid in this victory, especially in the year 1918. So Woodrow Wilson had a view what the world should look like at the end of World War I. He called it his 14 points for peace. So this was addressed to a joint session of the United States Senate on January 8th, 1918, okay? A little bit less than a year before the war ended. So basically, his 14 points were based on his understanding of how the Great War had begun and how future wars could be avoided. You know, we remember the causes, so Wilson was very aware of them. He wanted to end those secret treaties. He wanted to institute freedom of the seas, something that brought the United States into this war, freedom of trade, and an impartial settlement of colonial rivalries. Okay, so he wanted to end the imperialist ways that also had caused this war. He also did not want the Western powers to intervene in Russia. Obviously, a revolution was going on there. And he wanted full sovereignty brought back to Belgium and Alsace-Lorraine to France. He wanted the national groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire to have what's called self-determination. They determine what type of government they would have. Obviously, the Balkans being an area which led to the war, so he wanted to give them self-determination. Germany appeared willing to accept these points in January of 1918, but the British and French governments really did not have a lot of use for most of these points. They wanted an unconditional surrender and were not interested in Wilson's idealism at this time. So Croats and Slovenes announced they would join the Serbs in the establishment of a South Slav state called Yugoslavia. Hungary will proclaim its independence. I'm going to go over the Versailles Peace Treaty in a separate webcast. And we will learn that Austria-Hungary will sign an armistice on November 3rd, 1918, after the Italian army advanced into Habsburg territory. And on November 7th, 1918, the German Armistice Commission asked the Allies for an end to hostilities. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to Denmark after blaming the Jews and the socialists for the overthrow of the empire. And finally, on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, World War I is ended. The provisional German government signed an armistice. This was not a negotiated armistice, as we'll look at later. So to sum it up, let's look at the impact of the war. Okay, look at these casualties. You see Russia with huge casualties. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and France not far behind. But 9 million people killed in this war. And there was also a pandemic that was going on at the time, the Spanish influenza virus, in which estimates anywhere from 30 to 40 to 50 million additional people died during this war. So that is it for our overview of World War I. I hope you enjoyed this, and good night.